The Vince McMahon Netflix documentary series has officially been released. All 6 episodes are now available, and I polled you guys to see if you're watching. Almost a 50-50 split. Some of you guys are interested in this, some of you guys are not, and I understand both sides, but I did decide I was going to review it episode by episode here on the channel, and I'm not going to give you the play-by-play, every single little tiny detail throughout the entire 50-something minutes episode, but I will give you kind of some quick overall thoughts on what you can expect if you are going to watch it, or if you're not, you can maybe use this as a guide to tell you what you're missing. But episode number 1, titled Junior, which I think is very fitting because this really was about the dynamic and relationship between Vince McMahon and his father, Vince McMahon Sr. And again, that is kind of something where if you know the backstory and you know sort of the background of their relationship, you know how it sort of led to, a difference in vision in terms of the future of the WWF, now the WWE, at the time. And that was sort of, kind of the backdrop here for not only talking about that, but also talking about the personal relationship between the two. And keep in mind, there's a couple things I think you have to have context on as you're watching this series. And it was brought up early on. These interviews for this particular series started back in 2021. Think about how different the WWE is since 2021, but more specifically, how different Vince McMahon's world is since 2021 when he sat down to do these interviews. He gave this crew all the access for the interviews for this series. Think about how much has changed. So you have to know that going in. These are not recent interviews. These are interviews that some of them date back at least 3 years, I guess you could say now. So that is something to keep in mind as you're watching this, because again, we know a lot has changed. Vince McMahon's first exit from WWE after the Wall Street Journal thing came out. Then he kind of has the little bit of a return, but then he exits again due to the allegations that came out. And so there is a lot that has certainly changed since you have people talking about this. So you have to go in knowing that. Another thing that I have to keep in mind here, if you are someone who kind of understands and has studied, the history of professional wrestling, and you understand kind of how the WWF became the WWF, this is an episode where you're not really getting a lot of new knowledge, right? It is all about, minus one of the things we're going to talk about in a second, about how the WWF went from being just, again, kind of like a lot of other territory systems. It was a regional company where you're looking at it in the Northeast. You have all these other territories elsewhere in the United States and such. And so that's kind of where things were. But Vince McMahon, of course, ends up buying the company from his father and decides that he wants more. He sees a bigger vision for the WWF and decides that he is going to expand it, which of course led to him doing shows in other territories, which was a big no-no, of course, at the time. And then it leads to Vince ultimately bringing in a lot of that talent and squashing the territory system as we know it. If you already know how all that came about, you're not going to get a lot of new information here. But I think we all knew that going in. But remember something else. This is a series that is on Netflix, and a lot of the people watching on Netflix are going to be learning about a lot of this stuff for the first time. This is not just a series that is aimed at professional wrestling fans. This is much bigger because it is kind of one of those spotlighted type things on Netflix, and because Vince McMahon has been such a big topic beyond professional wrestling over the past couple of years for all the reasons we've talked about, we know this is going to attract a much larger audience. And so they are giving you kind of the history lesson, but it is important to understand some of the aspects of how not only the WWE became WWE, but how Vince McMahon became Vince McMahon. And that, I think, is what you're going to get out of this first episode, because the dynamic between him and his father is really, I think, the thing that stands out. There are some things that certainly we've learned over the years about their relationship and such, but hearing Vince actually talk about it and seeing him talk about it, that makes it a little bit different because, he kind of mentions here some of the things, and it was from the very beginning, something Vince said, where basically he's still trying to figure out who he is. And if you hear that line, again, now in 2024 versus maybe when he said it, we don't know if it's 2021, 2022, whatever, when that interview was recorded. But you hear it then, and sort of everything that has sort of come out since then. It seems like you're looking at someone here, and we know Vince McMahon, a very complicated individual, to put it lightly. And again, a lot of the stuff that's going to come out in terms of this series and the stuff you're going to, kind of hear people talk about along the way, a lot of it is stuff that we probably already had a pretty good grasp of. But you start to hear kind of the psyche of Vince McMahon, and you understand that it goes all the way back. And one of the things that really, and I think we're going to realize, and some of you have already watched the entire series, but the father-son dynamic is going to be something that is really on display, not just between Vince and Vince Sr., but also Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon. And we'll get to that because I think that is going to be something that will certainly play into future episodes of the series. But Vince sort of telling the backstory here of how he didn't know he was a McMahon until he was 12 years old. And, he winds up meeting Vince McMahon Sr. for the first time. And it's a couple things tying into that, right? He talks about how, he had a stepfather who was abusive, and talks about, he's mentioned this before on the Pat McAfee show and other interviews about how, it's his quote, got the crap beat out of him on a daily basis. And Vince finally meets his father. And he's expecting this huge response from Vince McMahon Sr., right? He's finally meeting his dad for the first time and thinking he's going to get this big hug and all this other stuff. And I think, as he referred to it, either just, got a little pat on the hand or whatever, something like that. And he was kind of caught off guard by that. So you kind of see how this is playing out, right? In terms of, here's this kind of lost teenager who is kind of coming into this thing and thinking that, all right, I finally meeting my dad and expecting something completely different, but it was Vince McMahon Sr., and it was someone who, again, as you kind of see just the relationship play out, all of a sudden Vince gets thrust into the business, Vince McMahon, like very quickly, in terms of eventually being the announcer for All-Star Wrestling, and, you can go back and watch some of those episodes. They're available on Peacock, WWE Network, where he's calling some of those, matches from the early 80s. I can remember I was actually watching recently the 1980 match between Bruno Sammartino and Larry Zbyszko, and you can hear Vince calling that on commentary and, those kind of things. And he kind of goes into talking about his vision for what wrestling was, right? You have an environment, you create that environment, you create characters, you do all these things in terms of, putting these characters in different situations, and then you have the big finish, right? And, talking about how easy the formula can be, but it's really hard to pull off. And that's kind of, sort of the backdrop there of Vince explaining his thoughts on, what exactly professional wrestling was or is, I guess, at this point. And so they really do go into, again, the backstory of talking about him choosing to make that deal with his father and thinking that his father did not believe he could pull this off, right? Basically, going into it feeling like his father thought he was going to fail, and, he didn't fail. We know that now because, like I mentioned, he does go in and have a lot of success. And, there are different people sort of bringing up the friction between Vince and Vince Sr. because it's not just the father-son thing, but you're talking about an actual working relationship here. And, basically Vince Sr. winds up working for Vince Jr., and that makes it even more complicated, right? When you think about kind of the relationship between the two. And, as Vince says, that's where his vision was so different. He wanted to make this a mainstream thing, whereas, maybe his father was more along the lines of trying to play nice with the territory system and not wanting to, kind of disrupt anything. Vince Jr. was the exact opposite. He wanted to get into the national expansion. He wanted to make this thing as big as it could possibly be, expand it beyond pro wrestling, become entertainment, which we know would ultimately be kind of, how this thing would play out. And so I think that is kind of the stuff that you talk about here in this first episode. And if you want to kind of take the biggest takeaways, it really is maybe some of the stuff of how their relationship was from the beginning with Vince McMahon Jr., Vince McMahon Sr., and how it was at the end. Because Vince brings up how the relationship was at the end. And he specifically talks about how his dad eventually told him, how proud he was of him. And Vince mentions how much that meant to him because he had finally gotten his father's approval, right? Because once they had expanded, once they had started having that kind of success, he finally got the approval from his father. But then what happens, right? His father passes away, and Vince says the day before his father passes away, his father told him he loved him for the first time. And you can see, what that meant to Vince McMahon. Again, this is where, knowing all the stuff we know about Vince McMahon, if you are able to sort of just for 1 second look at this and realize that this is the kind of access that people wanted for years and years and years to get from Vince McMahon, to get him telling his story in a raw fashion. Even though, as Hulk Hogan said in this thing, you're never going to get the full story in professional wrestling. There are always going to be things that people hold back. And even Vince himself here says that there are some things he's going to hold back. Kind of a haunting line when you think about it, however many years later after this was recorded. But if you really kind of think about just the dynamic of that, and maybe what kind of went into, like we said, the mindset of someone like Vince McMahon, who has seemingly, always business first, right? We know about all the stories, which again, you can kind of bring up the idea to dominate the territory system and have the entire professional wrestling world for himself here as one of the examples of that. But him specifically talking about what it meant for his father to tell him that he loved him, and it happens a day before his father passes away. Woo! I mean, that's one of those things, right? That's sort of, if you're looking for stuff that stands out in the series, that's going to be something where you're looking at, all right, this was something where, if you think about, if you're labeling Vince McMahon as a very complicated figure, these are the kind of things that when you hear him talk about it, you're like, all right, well, that definitely played into, some of that psyche, for however many years or however big parts of his life, right? And so that was something I definitely, thought was, I think, kind of the goal here, to establish the backstory of Vince McMahon and understand where he came from at the beginning and understand where the WWF came from at the beginning. And I think him talking about his relationship with Vince Sr. was probably the thing that stood out the most of episode number 1, which, like I said, makes sense. The episode was titled Junior, and, he was kind of seen as someone who had a different vision. And it was very clear that once he took things from his father, once he had the company, Vince was going to mold this into his own thing. And, of course, that led to so many things, right? Where you're talking about, bringing up Tuesday Night Titans. They start that show, the talk show, which was so different than anything else they had done. When you think about kind of where the WWF had been, then they start doing this late night style talk show with Vince McMahon as the host, and you're having all these wacky segments and all that. That was different than just treating professional wrestling as, a sports-based element like so many territories and such had done before that, even though there were entertainment aspects added in. And then, of course, it expands beyond that. You get into sort of the connection with MTV. They do the War to Settle the Score. They have WrestleMania 1 where you're getting Cyndi Lauper and all the different celebrities involved. And so that kind of establishes that this is not, Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF anymore. This is a new frontier for the World Wrestling Federation, right? That's what this was. It was completely different than anything we had seen before, and I think that is really, like I said, I don't think there's a lot more to this first episode other than just really hammering home what the father-son relationship was between Vince and Vince, and you kind of got that here. And keep in mind, too, Vince McMahon is not actually a Vince McMahon Jr., but we may call him that at times because that's the easiest way to separate Junior and Senior. Because that's what he was called, right? And that's kind of, again, part of the reason why it's titled this way, is because everyone would just call him Junior. But eventually, Junior becomes Senior in terms of being the person who's running the show. And, that, of course, leads into the thing where Vince says it here. Everybody always says there's no such thing as bad publicity. Well, that's not true. And that, I think, is kind of your tease for the next part of the series, which will start to get into more of the scandals and all that. Although you did have some of the stuff here where, you've got the David Schultz thing of knocking out, John Stossel, the ABC News reporter, who's trying to expose the business. You've got the segment, the infamous thing with Hulk Hogan, who goes on the Richard Belzer show, and Hogan's, just kind of going to rough him up a little bit to show him that professional wrestling is real because it was all about protecting kayfabe and all that. Belzer ends up falling on the floor, busting his head open. Lawsuits against, both kind of have lawsuits against the WWF, both Stossel and Belzer, and they end up settling. I think one was 1987 and one was 1990. And so that is kind of establishing that as you grow as a company, you're going to have a lot more eyeballs on you. And so the rock and wrestling era, sort of begins. You get all the MTV tie-ins and you get all the celebrities and all this mainstream attention, which can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. And we started to see some of the cracks come in on that, and we know that would only increase throughout the years with different, scandals and different things, tragedies, of course, that would happen. And I know those are going to be addressed in this series as well. But I would say this is one of those episodes where it really, like I said, beyond just establishing sort of what you should know about the father-son dynamic between the two, I don't think there's probably a lot here for the hardcore fans, unless, again, you just want to go back and revisit some of the old footage from the 80s and such, which I always enjoy watching, but you can do that anytime on Peacock or the WWE Network. So if you want to get some of that, I think this was sort of the calm before the storm, I guess you could say, because things are really going to pick up from here, but you at least kind of needed to get into Vince talking about his family history and that kind of stuff, and at least giving the people who do not know all the backstory kind of the foundation they need to work with to understand how this company went from being just like a lot of other wrestling companies to being something completely different. And that's what happened, and I think that's going to be kind of the story, both the good and bad, of the rest of this Vince McMahon series, Mr. McMahon, on Netflix. So there you go, guys. Again, there's just some random thoughts on this first episode. Again, let me know what you thought if you've watched it. And you can go ahead and let me know what you thought about the entire series, because, again, I'm going one by one here, and I know there's a lot of other stuff we're going to get into, and I think a lot of the other stuff will be a bit deeper than this first episode, because we know of still what's to come in terms of the history of WWE. So there you go, guys. There's some thoughts on this episode. Let me know your thoughts. And again, be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button on your way out. We don't just review these kind of series. Of course, we review everything going on in the WWE each week with thoughts on Raw, SmackDown, and a lot of other fun stuff as well. And also, just to let you guys know, I am trying to kind of get more active on Twitter/X, which I don't know if that's a good idea, but I'm at least trying. So you guys, if you want to, you can follow me on that platform at WrestleBlake. I couldn't come up with anything better. There wasn't anything better available. So at WrestleBlake, put it into your Twitter and follow me there for more thoughts on everything going on in WWE and professional wrestling. So appreciate you guys watching as always. And again, let me know your thoughts on episode number 1 of Mr. McMahon.